Hello, everyone. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with where you from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep pulling you stories like this. Now, let the shadows take over. Story 1. The Ravenswood Gauge. When you're 11 years old, the world is measured by proximity. The scariest place you can imagine is usually just outside the radius of your parents' control. For me and my two friends, Sam and Mia, that place was the very edge of my backyard, where the suburban lawn dissolved into the ancient, silent woods of Ravenswood. It was the peak of summer, but the night felt aggressively cold. A profound, wet fog had rolled in, saturating the air and muting all sound. We were inside a cheap, dome-shaped tent, a flimsy shell of nylon and aluminum that felt less like shelter and more like a glowing target. We had convinced ourselves we were brave, whispering stories in the narrow beam of a dying flashlight. But the silence outside was too heavy. The fog, thick and gray, didn't just obscure our vision, it swallowed all the ambient noise, the distant hum of highway traffic, the wind in the leaves, even the usual chirping of crickets. The world had gone deaf in 0830. The only sound that remained was the unnerving drip of condensation from the tent ceiling, landing softly on the synthetic sleeping bags, making the whole interior feel wet and confining. I was lying on my back, tracing the fluorescent glow of the tent fabric when I felt Sam stiffen beside me. He didn't speak. He just slowly raised a trembling finger and pointed toward the rear vent of the tent, where the mesh provided a blurred view of the tree line. Standing there, perfectly framed between two thick oak trees, was the silhouette. It was monstrously tall, not just tall, but an impossible slender height that defied human proportions. The top of its head was lost entirely in the upper layer of the thick fog, making it seem like a black, elongated column of shadow supporting the night sky. It was utterly terrifyingly still. It wasn't hiding, it was observing. It looked like a natural feature of the environment that had suddenly decided to stand up and face us. The silence from the forest, which had been unnerving before, now became an absolute void pressing in on the thin nylon walls. 1:09:55. We didn't breathe. We didn't move. Three 11-year-olds inside a flimsy plastic bubble, paralyzed by a sight that violated every known law of shape and scale. The silhouette stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, a black needle measuring the boundary between civilization and the wild. Then, with an agonizing slowness, the silhouette turned its head, shifting its focus from the tent to the deep, impenetrable woods behind it. And then, without any discernible movement of its body, the entire shape simply vanished, swallowed by the black pines. The immediate aftermath was pure, hyperventilating relief. We convinced ourselves it was a trick of the light, a misplaced tree trunk, but we stayed awake, huddled together, listening to the slow, muffled drumming of our own terrified hearts. About 40 minutes later, the terror returned, no longer visual, but physical. It didn't come from the distance. It came from right outside the tent. We heard a sound so small, yet so devastatingly close, the soft, wet thud of something heavy landing on the dirt directly beside the tent wall. The entire structure was then briefly compressed from the side, as if something immense had leaned against it. The nylon strained, creating a low, taut humming sound. Mia let out a choked cry, covering her mouth. The air in the tent became impossibly cold. I felt a slight, cold pressure on the sole of my right foot. I had kicked my leg outside the sleeping bag, letting my foot rest against the tent floor. Then the pressure intensified. There was a faint, rasping sound, like coarse fabric tearing. It was the sound of the bottom edge of the tent wall being quietly, deliberately pulled loose from the ground stakes. And then, through the thin gap created where the nylon met the damp grass, a cold, heavy pressure grabbed my ankle, 11/20. It was a grip of immense, absolute strength. It wasn't a hand, it was too wide, too rough, like a massive claw or the end of a thick, muddy root. It was wet and cold, instantly soaking the thin cotton of my sock. I screamed a high, unnatural sound that echoed strangely in the fog-dampened air. The grip tightened, a bruising compression that began to pull me toward the edge of the tent. The sound of the zipper ripping as the tent fabric strained against the anchor was deafening. Sam and Mia reacted instinctively. They grabbed my arms, pulling with all the frantic strength of panic. For a few agonizing seconds, it was a tug of war. 3 terrified kids against an impossible, brute force that came from the black dirt beneath the tent. Then, with a final, wet slurp, the pressure released. I scrambled backward, pulling my foot free, gasping for air. We didn't waste a second. We tore the zipper open, abandoned the tent, and ran across the lawn and through the back door of the house, screaming until my parents came running. The police were dismissive. They cataloged the frantic, tearful testimonies of 3 scared children and the slightly torn bottom edge of the nylon tent. They treated it like a prank, an intruder, or an animal attack. But the next morning, a lone officer walked the perimeter with my father. He stopped at the edge of the tree line. There, leading from the deep grass toward the abandoned tent, was a single, perfect indentation, a boot print. It wasn't a standard hiking boot. It was enormous, long, wide, and strangely flat, as if pressed by incredible weight. It was caked in the thick, black mud of the deep forest, mud that only exists far past the garden fences, or 113 osiers. The officer bent down, measured it, and looked back at the empty tent. He looked up at the terrifying, silent wall of the Ravenswood forest. They searched the area for days. They found no other prints, no drag marks, no sign of entry or exit. Only that one, single, impossibly large muddy boot print, leading straight from the black woods, stopping right beside the torn tent fabric, and ending there. The suspect was never caught because, perhaps, there was no suspect to catch. I am not 11 anymore. I've moved far away from Ravenswood, but sometimes, when I'm alone and the lights are off, I feel a faint, phantom pressure on my right ankle. It's a chilling reminder that the terror wasn't just about what was in the woods. It was about the moment that terrifying thing crossed the boundary and touched me. The police found the print, but they couldn't find the fear, because that particular, bone-deep, claustrophobic fear never really leaves you. It just waits, perfectly preserved, for the next moment of darkness. Story 2, The Hayloft Lesson, Rookery Barn. I was 17 the summer I stayed with my granddad in Dorset. It wasn't the picturesque seaside Dorset you see on postcards. This was the deep, working countryside, endless, rolling fields that felt ancient, and nights that were absolutely, profoundly black. My cousin, Maya, was there too. We were classic, bored teenagers, desperate to push back against the stifling quiet of Granddad's farm. That farm had one specific place that radiated a cold, deep energy, the Rookery Barn. It was a towering, century-old structure of timber and cracked concrete, and it smelled permanently of dry hay, thick dust, and faint, cold rust. The whole place was whispering with secrets, and we decided we needed to hear them. The plan was a sleepover in the hayloft. It was pure, stupid teenage rebellion, ignoring the single rigid rule Granddad had set. "You stay out of that barn after sunset," he'd warned us that morning, his eyes hard and fixed. "It's not safe. Things move around at night that ain't sheep, and they ain't meant to be seen." We, of course, took that as an invitation. We waited until the moon was high and Granddad's light was out. We crept across the damp yard, the air cold and smelling sharply of earth and manure, and slipped into the cavernous darkness of the barn. We climbed the rickety wooden ladder into the hayloft. It was huge, lined with dense, golden bales that piled up to the roof rafters. The atmosphere was immediately claustrophobic. The air was thick with hay dust that made our lungs ache, and the heat trapped beneath the corrugated iron roof was oppressive. We burrowed into the hay bales, using my phone's dim flashlight to establish our perimeter. Below us, the main barn floor was an abyss of shadow and old farming machinery, a deep, dark basin we couldn't see into. We tried to talk, but the effort felt too loud. We felt exposed. Our breathing was heavy, amplified by the dense bales surrounding us, mingling with the soft, constant shifting and scratching of field mice in the hay. 14, 15. We didn't have to wait long for the warning to prove itself. It was just past midnight. The weak moonlight was filtering through cracks in the wooden siding, creating thin, luminous vertical stripes across the hay bales. A sound, not from within the barn, but from the yard outside, stopped us cold. It was the heavy, reluctant creak of the main barn doors slowly being pulled open. The sound was thick with rust and strained wood, deliberate and slow, lasting several agonizing seconds. We immediately killed the phone light and flattened ourselves into the hay, breathing the dry dust deeply into our terror-clenched throats. The silence from the main floor of the barn became absolute, a profound, anticipatory void. We heard the footsteps enter. They were heavy, slow, and measured, walking on the hard concrete floor below us. They sounded like thick, rubber-soled work boots, not the quick, clean step of a person casually walking, but the slow, weighted stride of someone carrying a massive burden. Then we saw him. A tall, hooded figure moved into the small patch of moonlight illuminating the center of the barn floor. The figure was entirely covered in some kind of heavy, dark, waxen material that made no noise as he moved. He was dense, bulky, and radiated an unsettling stillness, or 1530. The burden was terrible. He was dragging something behind him, pulled along by a rope or a chain that made no sound on the floor. It was a sack, large, dark, and misshapen, about the size of a man's torso. And it was twitching. Not a simple mechanical shift, but a complex, biological shudder that ran up the length of the fabric. Every time the hooded figure paused, the sack would give a short, frantic spasm, followed by a quick, horrifying silence. The sheer horror of witnessing a crime, or something worse, drove out all denial. This wasn't a joke. This was real. Cold dread happening 20 feet below us. The figure reached the dark, unlit corner of the barn, stopping directly beneath the loft where the main silage chute dropped down. The figure looked up slowly, directly at the shadow of the hayloft access point, the only way in or out. He couldn't see us, but the knowledge that we were suspended above him, hidden by the dust and the darkness, was suffocating. The figure stayed motionless for a full minute, that heavy, dark form holding the twitching sack. The silence was broken only by the whistle of the wind through the cracks in the walls and the agonizing slow beat of my own heart. Then he dropped the sack. The sound was a dull, heavy thud on the concrete. The sack gave a single, violent, final twitch, and then became absolutely still. The figure then slowly turned his back to the loft and bent over the motionless sack. It was our window. Maya and I moved instantly, silently. We didn't scramble for the phone or the light. We looked for a weapon. We found it leaning against the wall near the loft railing, an old wooden-handled pitchfork, its tines dull and rusty, but long and lethal. We knew we couldn't climb down. We had to seal ourselves in. We found a section of the wooden railing that was loose. Working with silent, desperate adrenaline, we wrestled a large, square hay bale easily 150 pounds into the access hole of the loft. We then wedged the rusty tines of the pitchfork into the crack above the bale, using it as a brace, creating a makeshift barricade, a 117 or 10. The noise was minimal, muffled by the surrounding hay, but it was enough. The figure below straightened up. The only thing separating us from him was the loft floor, the hay bale, and a desperate piece of rusted metal. We lay on our bellies, pitchfork still in hand, staring into the blackness, listening to the heavy footsteps move directly beneath us. He stood below the barricade for a long time. We heard a soft scraping sound, then a pause, and then the footsteps slowly retreated toward the main doors. The doors creaked open, the sound lasting forever, and then slammed shut with an echoing finality that made us jump. The barn was silent again, save for the scratching of the mice. We stayed there until dawn, the rising sun turning the dusty hayloft into a golden, suffocating oven. When the sunlight streamed through the cracks, we slowly dismantled the barricade and crept down. The center of the barn floor was clean, no blood, no rope, no sack. Only in the corner, where the figure had bent over his burden, did we find anything. Resting neatly on a pile of old sacking were half a dozen freshly skinned animal pelts, foxes, rabbits, and something else, something larger and darker. They were clean, professionally treated, but still disturbingly moist. They were not evidence of a crime, but of a brutal, cold occupation, 18 to 45. My grandparents, when they finally came out, found the barn doors locked tight and the hay bale moved. They never asked why. They didn't need to. The knowledge was in their eyes, a quiet vigilance that we now shared. We left Dorset that week. Years have passed, and I still can't stand being in a small, closed space in the dark. The police would have called it simple poaching, a low-level operation, but I know what I saw. I know the feeling of a presence that is not meant to be there, and I know that curiosity and carelessness often invite danger. Granddad wasn't warning us about ghosts. He was warning us about the things that thrive in the dark because they rely on other people's disregard. And the truest lesson of the Rookery Barn is this courage isn't found in a pitchfork, but in quiet vigilance. The night is not empty, and the space between what you know and what is actually there is often occupied by something cold, heavy, and silently waiting. Story 3: The Edge of Observation. My name is Harper, and I've never been able to look into a mirror the same way since. This happened 2 years ago, when I drove up the coast to visit my friend Lydia at her family's house near the Monterey Cliffs. The timing was terrible. A massive Pacific storm had decided to roll in, creating a setting that felt less like a retreat and more like a punishment. The house was built right on the precipice, overlooking a 100-foot drop to the churning, gray ocean. That weekend, We were completely alone, wrapped in a constant, deafening roar. The air inside the house felt charged with static and the cold, metallic tang of salt spray. The sound was the worst part, a relentless, frantic howl of the wind that attacked the glass windows, making them visibly shudder. Every 10 minutes, a fresh sheet of rain would crash against the house with the sound of a collapsing wave, blinding the windows completely before draining away, leaving the glass momentarily clear, then instantly misted over again. Lydia and I were huddled in the living room, trying to watch a movie, but the atmosphere was too volatile. The house felt like a boat adrift in a storm, rattling with every gust. We kept the lights low, the only illumination coming from the TV screen and the sporadic, violent blue-white flashes of lightning that would momentarily turn the room into a stark, overexposed photograph. The message in the mist. It was late, maybe 1:00 a.m. The storm had intensified to a fever pitch. The wind was a physical presence, pressing against the window. Lydia was talking about moving to the city, the sound of her voice thin and small against the chaos of the weather. I was looking past her, staring out at the sliding glass door that led to the deck, which was now a smear of running water and reflected light. During a lull in the rain, just a momentary pause, the light of the living room cast a pale reflection onto the glass. And in that reflection, briefly visible outside, was a figure. It was impossibly dark, a hooded shadow, thicker and denser than the surrounding mist. It was standing directly on the deck, inches from the glass. The fabric of its hood was slick with water, catching the faint reflection of the interior light. It was tall, motionless, and aimed directly at us. Before I could scream, the figure moved. It didn't retreat. It leaned forward, in its hand a black, waterlogged shape lifted slowly and pressed against the outside of the glass. The storm was making the window mist and streak, a perfect canvas for violation. The dark hand dragged slowly across the condensation, wiping the mist away with deliberate, chilling strokes. It was writing! As the rain sheeted down again, blurring the lines, the lightning flashed a brilliant, momentary explosion of light that perfectly illuminated the words the figure had just etched into the exterior mist. 1945. The message was scrawled backward, a simple, terrifying certainty. I see you. The letters were thick and dripping, written in the perfect, unsettling negative space of the condensation. The hand retracted, the dark figure dissolved back into the howling storm, and the rain washed the message away in less than 3 seconds. The empty end. We didn't call the police right away. We spent the next hour locked in a silent, panicked debate, convincing ourselves it was a trick of the moisture, or a hallucination born from the exhaustion and the noise. But the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world rinsed clean and unnervingly quiet. We went out onto the deck. The deck was soaked, but otherwise clear. We found what confirmed our terror immediately, a series of heavy, deep footprints pressed into the soft, rain-dampened earth around the edge of the house, leading from the dense, cliffside scrub. The police came, mostly out of pity. An officer documented the prints, measuring the strange, heavy tread. The chilling conclusion was delivered an hour later. The footprints did not lead back into the woods, and they did not continue along the perimeter. They simply followed a direct path to the sheer 100-foot drop of the cliff edge and stopped. They vanished where the ground vanished. The man had walked to the edge, stood there, and then simply ceased to be. Year 1/21/20. 21. There was no struggle, no slip, and no body found below in the crashing surf. It was impossible. and the police dismissed it as erosion or an odd pattern left by the tide mist. But Lydia and I knew the observer hadn't left. He had disincorporated. We left the coast that day, desperate to put distance between us and the howling wind, but the message had already been delivered. We were back in the city, safe in Lydia's apartment, 300 miles from the salt spray. We were trying to watch a mundane sitcom, trying to inject normalcy back into our lives. Lydia walked into the bathroom. She paused at the large, recessed mirror above the sink, adjusting her hair. She screamed, a thin, strangled sound of absolute terror. I ran in. Lydia was backed against the wall, pointing a trembling finger at the mirror. The surface of the glass was clean, dry, and perfect, but deep within the reflection of the bathroom light, etched not onto the surface, but somehow inside the silvering of the mirror itself, was the same message. It was permanent, embedded in the reflection, visible only when the light hit it just right, as if written in the deepest layer of the glass, I see you 2230. It was no longer an external threat on the glass of the storm. It was an internalized presence, etched into the object we use to verify our own existence. We returned to the Cliff House weeks later, bringing high-resolution cameras and tripods, desperate to capture the observer on film to prove what we knew was real. We spent 3 straight nights setting up motion sensors and recording every window, every corner, but the figure never returned to the glass, and the footprints remained a geological impossibility. We solved nothing. We caught nothing. We simply learned that the message of the storm wasn't intended to scare us out of the house, but to inform us that we had been tagged. And now, years later, every time I look into a mirror, I don't just see myself. I see the cold, unmoving truth that the hooded shadow on the Monterey cliffs left behind, that the space between observation and violation is narrower than glass, and the threat you can't capture is the one that never really leaves your reflection. 2345. Story 4. The Whistle in the Onwald Lodge. The place was called Onwald Lodge, deep in the snowbound timber country of the Rockies. It was Christmas break, and my friend Miles and I, both 20 and feeling immortal, had rented the isolated cabin for a weekend of total disconnection. By Saturday morning, the disconnection was absolute. The snow had come down in silent, unforgiving walls, burying the access road under 6 feet of fresh powder. We were trapped, completely cut off. The sound of the world was replaced by a dull, constant thrumming silence, broken only by the deep, rhythmic crackle of the fireplace and the metallic smell of wood smoke and damp cedar. The lodge itself was old, built with heavy, dark timber. Every shadow felt dense, and the only light came from the fireplace and the wide, staring windows that framed nothing but white, infinite landscape. It was oppressive, beautiful, and utterly unnerving. The one-way perimeter. Our fear didn't start with a sound. It started with the absence of one. Around noon, we ventured out onto the back porch to clear a path to the woodpile. The snow was pristine, untouched. We wore heavy boots and left clean, deep tracks from the porch steps to the stack of wood and back. But as we were scraping the last of the ice off the steps, Miles froze, staring past our own footprints. "Rowan," he whispered, his voice catching the cold air. "Look at that." Leading directly toward the back of the house, stopping exactly at the base of the porch steps where we now stood, was a separate set of footprints. They were small, distinct, and flat, like the tracks of a child wearing flimsy, worn leather boots. But the violation wasn't just the size, it was the direction. They were one-way tracks. The trail began far out in the fresh, unbroken snow, winding its way through the snow-laden pines. They led with unnerving certainty toward the lodge, stopped at the steps, and then vanished. There were no return prints, no sign of the figure having turned around, no continuation of the tracks anywhere on the porch or leading back into the forest. It was an entrance without an exit. Whoever or whatever had walked up to our steps had simply dematerialized the moment they reached the boundary of the lodge. We rationalized it wine patterns, a melting anomaly, a snowshoe track blown over, but the cold paralysis of the image, a path leading directly to our front door that suddenly ceased to exist, planted a hard, frozen seed of paranoia in the cabin. The high, lonely sound. That night, the snow and the silence pressed down harder. The wind was a low, mournful sighing in the chimney. We locked every window and door, the metallic clink of the bolt sounding impossibly loud in the silence. It began at 2:00 a.m. The sound was faint, high, and fragile. A whistle. It wasn't a warning, and it wasn't a threat. It was a tune, a simple, melancholic melody, played with a childlike breathiness that seemed to barely pierce the static of the cold night air. It sounded intensely lonely. It was impossible to place. It didn't come from the fireplace, or the walls, or the woods. It seemed to circle the house. One minute it was directly under the living room window, muffled by the timber. The next, it was tapping faintly against the kitchen glass. Miles and I huddled by the fire, our eyes darting to every window. The sound design of the lodge was terrifyingly specific, the slow drip of thawing ice on the eaves, the creak of the rafters settling, and then, cutting through the silence, the high, wavering, circling whistle. It was the sound of a small child lost outside, shivering in the endless snow, desperately calling out without knowing where to go. The horror was not that we were being stalked, but that we were being pleaded with. We realized that whatever had made those one-way footprints was now trapped outside, circling our temporary haven. The footprints hadn't vanished. The figure had simply stepped up onto the porch and remained tethered to the house. The whistling intensified around 300 a.m., becoming so close it felt as if the sound source was pressed against the exterior wall directly behind the couch. It felt like an invasion, the audio equivalent of being watched. We spent the remainder of the night gripping the pitchfork we'd pulled from the shed, staring into the dark. The unseen life. The morning came, soft and pale. The whistling had stopped around dawn. We were exhausted, our eyes bloodshot from fear. We opened the back door slowly, dreading what we might find on the porch. The snow was freshly dusted, no new prints, and certainly no sign of the hooded figure or freezing child we had imagined. But at the base of the top porch step, resting on the raw timber, was a small, delicate object. It was a paper crane. It was intricately folded from a piece of paper that looked like it had been torn from a children's drawing pad, faded yellow, with faint pencil marks still visible on the wings. It was a gesture of pure, quiet grace, impossibly complex and beautifully out of place against the rough wood and the wild snow. The custodian, an old man named Elms, pulled up in his snowmobile around noon, clearing the final barricade of snow. We didn't mention the whistle or the prints. The mystery felt too delicate, too personal to expose to his practical disbelief. As he was packing up the trash, Miles asked him about the lodge's history. Elms paused, looking out at the white forest. Ah, this old place. Lot of years on her. You get used to the sounds. She's mostly quiet now, but there was a boy here, maybe 80 years back. Little guy, named Thomas. He loved to whistle, got caught in a blizzard outside the main door, just like this. They never found him. "But sometimes," Elm said, looking up at the closed attic window, "when the snow is thick, you can still hear him looking for someone to open the door." He wasn't telling us a scary story. He was sharing a piece of the house's persistent, quiet sadness. The paper crane was Thomas's thank you. The footprints were his frantic arrival. The whistling wasn't a threat. It was the plaintive call of a lonely child spirit, simply seeking company, a witness, or a moment of warmth. We left the Onwald Lodge that day, but we took the crane. We had come seeking thrills and had instead encountered a ghost whose primary characteristic was grief, not malice. The mystery remains unsolved. The prince and the crane are illogical, but the true insight of the lodge is clear. Not all mysteries threaten. Some remind us to respect unseen life. The world is filled with fragile presences, and sometimes courage is simply the quiet act of listening to the lonely sounds and giving them the gentle recognition they deserve. I've generated the story, The Whistle in the Onwald Lodge, which integrates the snowbound setting, the one-way footprints, the haunting whistle, and the emotional twist of the paper crane, achieving the requested cinematic and fearmonger style with a non-malevolent outcome. Story 5. The Cold Gauge Bootprint at Lake Lucerne. The place was a rental chalet tucked high in the mountains above Lake Lucerne. It was late November, and the world had contracted down to a tight circle of light and warmth. I was there with Greta, seeking isolation and quiet, but what we found was something far colder. The chalet was wood and glass, framed by a dense, silent pine forest. The air was thin, biting, and smelled of wood resin and frozen lake water. The trouble started when the power went out. It didn't flicker, it didn't stutter. One moment, the room was bathed in the warm electric glow of the interior lights. The next, the world was plunged into a total, absolute blackout. The silence that followed was terrifying. The sudden cessation of the refrigerator's hum, the soft, distant sound of the internet modem, the simple hum of being connected, all gone. The only illumination came from the flickering gas fire and the frantic, shallow beams of our phone flashlights. Outside the massive picture windows, the night was a profound, suffocating blackness. The scraping in the loft. The chalet had a small, unfinished loft accessible by a pull-down ladder, a dark storage space directly above the main bedroom. We were sitting by the fire, talking in low, strained voices, trying to sound brave. When the sound began, it came from directly above us. It was a slow, uneven scraping sound, not the rhythmic sound of an animal, but a grinding, deliberate movement like a heavy, soft body being slowly dragged across rough timber. Skr, skr. We looked up, past the wood beams of the ceiling, into the oppressive silence of the upper floor. "It's just the house settling," Greta whispered, her voice tight and high. But houses settling don't pause. Houses settling don't change direction. The scraping stopped, and then, after a 2-second silence that felt like a lifetime, the sound began again, but now it was directly over the bedroom. It was methodical, searching, and it radiated a heavy, unnatural silence that swallowed the crackle of the fire. We didn't sleep. We spent the rest of the night rigid on the couch, listening to the impossible sounds of something large and heavy being slowly rearranged in a space that should have been empty. The melting proof. The next morning, the power was still out. The mountain was silent, bathed in a weak, gray light. We forced ourselves to check the loft. We pulled down the ladder. The air that rushed out was stale, cold, and utterly neutral. The space was empty dust, insulation, and the raw wood of the unfinished floor. Nothing was moved. No animal tracks. We spent the morning in denial until we stepped outside. The night had brought a light, fresh snowfall. The entire perimeter of the chalet was pristine, a perfect white canvas. And then we saw the boot print. It was a single, large, deep indentation, a clean, heavy press of a work boot, right in the fresh snow, about 10 feet from the front door. But as we looked closer, the single print was not just a single print. It was a series of prints, following the exact same devastatingly simple path. They began at the back corner of the chalet, continued along the entire side of the house, circled the front, and then continued along the other side, right back to the original corner, a perfect perimeter circle. But the prints were all facing the house. Every single print, tracing the long path around the chalet, was oriented inward, as if the walker was keeping their eyes fixed on the windows, measuring the interior space. And then we noticed the final, terrifying detail: the snow inside the boot prints was melting. It was below freezing, yet the compressed snow inside every single print was already turning into clear, cold water, while the surrounding powder remained dry. It was the heat of a living thing, radiating off the sole of the boot, that was melting the snow. The one-way prints meant the figure had circled the house, never taking their eyes off it, and the melting snow meant the contact was fresh. But the circle ended where it began. There were no prints leading away from the chalet. The figure had circled the house, and then, at the back corner, it had entered, and the scraping above the loft meant it was still inside. Vigilance. We fled the chalet immediately, leaving the gas fire burning. We told the property manager we lost the keys and abandoned the lease. We never solved it. The police found nothing but melting prints and an empty loft. Years later, I still find myself looking up at the ceiling when a noise happens. I still feel the cold dread of that scraping sound. But the fear has transformed into something sharper, colder, and more useful awareness. The scraping wasn't just a sound, it was a demonstration of access. The melting snow wasn't just a clue, it was proof that the boundary between outside and inside is meaningless to a truly dedicated observer. The lesson of that night in the blackout was not that we were hunted, but that we were tested. The silence and the snow were the apparatus, and our carelessness was the invitation. The unknown is always close, silent, and waiting for the moment you think you are safe. And the only thing that ensures survival is the cold, lifelong caution that vigilance and respect for the unknown are the only true locks on the door. This cinematic rewrite, the cold gauge boot print at Lake Lucerne, integrates the total blackout, the scraping sound, the perfect inward-facing prints, and the horrifying detail of the melting snow, delivering the requested lesson on lifelong vigilance. Story 6, the Watermark Canal House in Bruges. There are places so old they feel less like homes and more like custodians of human silence. Bruges, in late autumn, is one of them. The air hangs perpetually heavy and cold, smelling of damp brick, wood smoke, and the cold, mineral scent of the canal water that laps perpetually against the stone foundations. My 2 friends and I, 3 students, sharing a cheap rental for a week, were staying in one of those tall, impossibly narrow houses that leaned precariously over the water. The rooms were small, the walls were thick plaster, and the ancient staircase twisted upward like a spine of dark wood. The atmosphere was perfect until the paranoia began to seep in. The unthinkable trace. It was late, maybe 3 a.m. We had settled in, talking in low whispers that seemed to be swallowed instantly by the thick walls. The only sound was the plaintive moan of the wind outside, driving a dense, bone-chilling fog that pressed against the tall, narrow windows. I went downstairs for water. The main floor was black, illuminated only by the faint, diffused orange glow that filtered in from the cobblestone street. As I reached the foot of the stairs, my phone flashlight beam caught something on the stone landing. It was a footprint. Not mud, not dust, but thick, impossibly wet, tracking across the old dry floorboards. It was the print of a bare, small foot, and the water left behind was cold, clear, and carried the specific, unmistakable smell of the canal. I froze, scanning the locked door in the opaque windows. There was no way in, but the proof was there, a single glistening print. And then I saw the trail. The prints continued, single file, tracking up the dark, ancient wooden staircase. Every step drip, 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 leaving a precise wet mark on the dry wood. I backed away, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the sudden, crushing silence. We were on the second floor. Whoever this was, they had not only entered a securely locked house, but had somehow brought the canal itself in with them, leaving the trail of cold, wet water leading upward to the unknown. The attic melody. My friend, Leah and Sam, were immediately swept into the terror. We confirmed all the doors were locked, and we stood at the base of the second floor, staring up the dark well of the twisting stairs. The prints ended on the top landing. There was only one place left to go, the attic. The attic access was through a small square hatch in the ceiling, sealed with a heavy, old-fashioned bolt. It was unreachable without a ladder. We stood there for 5 full minutes, flashlight beams fixed on the ceiling, listening to the suffocating silence of the old house. Then, we heard the second violation, not physical, but auditory. A sound, high and distant, filtered down through the thick plaster. It was a child humming. The melody was simple, fragile, and achingly off-key, an improvised lullaby that seemed to float just above the frequencies of human hearing. It was the most isolating sound I have ever experienced, the noise of profound, essential loneliness, echoing in an unreachable space. The humming continued, rhythmic and cyclical. It was a sound of persistence, not play. It was the sound of a spirit who had been waiting for centuries in the cold dark. We called the police. They were predictably dismissive. They climbed up, checked the attic, shone their lights over the dusty floor, and confirmed the windows were sealed and the roof line was secure. They found nothing. No break-in, no squatters, no wet footprints. The stone floor had dried long ago. They treated us like paranoid tourists. But we knew the humming was real, and the prints were real. The plea for recognition, we were driven out of the main house and took refuge in the small, stone-lined basement parlor the next day. The house felt polluted, violated by the impossible presence in the attic. It was Sam who found them. While tracing the plaster patterns near the fireplace, he noticed a section of wallpaper that felt strangely loose. He peeled it back. Behind it was a small, crudely built wooden box, hidden deep in the recess of the brick. Inside the box were old, brittle photographs, stained brown with age and damp. They were images from the late 1920s or 1930s street scenes of Bruges, blurry portraits of somber-looking adults. And then, one photo, a small girl, no older than 5, wearing a thin dress. Her face, even in the faded image, was stricken with absolute silent terror. Her hands were small fists, her eyes wide and black. The photo was taken from a strange angle, low to the ground, looking up at the canal. On the back of the photograph, Scrawled in thin, spidery French was a single devastating sentence: Margot, never again. We pieced it together with a frantic, sickening clarity. The canal house, the wet footprints, the child's humming. The story wasn't one of a random haunting. It was a historical echo. Margot, the forgotten trauma of a child's life, ending not in an accident, but in a final, cold moment of terror by the very water that now tracked into the house. The humming wasn't a threat. It was a desperate, ceaseless attempt to gain a witness. The wet footprints were her grief and her memory following us, trying to leave a visible mark in a world that had forgotten her. We never heard the humming again after that day. We left the canal house, but first, we did something simple. We found a small white candle, lit it, and placed it on the attic floor, a recognition, a final, warm sign of peace left for a child who died cold and terrified. The haunting ceased not because we fled, but because we recognized it. The true, cold dread of that house was not the ghost, but the indifference of the world that had allowed her death to become a secret and her presence to become a haunting. The lesson of the Bruges Canal House is profound. True terror is indifference. Empathy can quiet what fear amplifies. Sometimes the things that go bump in the night aren't seeking to harm you. They are simply seeking to be remembered, and our willingness to listen is the only key they need. Story 7, The Stone Gauge, Tuscan Villa Tragedy. The place felt ancient, built for a permanence that defied modern life. We were at a remote, stone Tuscan villa, just my father, me, and my closest friend, Rowan. The air was thick with the late summer scent of rosemary and dry dust, and the nights were absolute star-choked and devoid of any light beyond the perimeter of the property. We were teenagers, 17, treating the trip as a final, glorious sleepover. My father, a man whose presence was usually a warm anchor, had retired early downstairs, leaving us to whisper secrets in the vast, echoing second-floor bedroom. The only sound was the distant, mesmerizing drone of the cicadas outside, and the cool, constant sound of the wind sighing over the clay roof tiles. We thought we were safe, hidden by miles of rolling fields and the thick, protective stone walls of the villa. We thought the greatest threat was boredom. We were wrong. The sound of violation. It was 2:30 a.m. I was almost asleep, drifting in the silence, when the world cracked open. The first sound was not loud, but devastatingly precise, the high, brittle shatter of glass from the first floor, immediately followed by the sickening scrape of a heavy object metal, perhaps being dragged across the polished tile floor. My eyes snapped open. Rowan was already sitting up, rigid, her face pale in the faint moonlight filtering through the shutters. The second sound was the one that curdled my blood. It was a thick, wet thud, followed by a choked, desperate, muffled grunt, a sound I recognized instantly as my father's voice, quickly cut off. It was a noise of pain and surprise, swallowed instantly by the vast, echoing acoustics of the old stone villa. We didn't need to speak. We knew the quiet, casual horror of an intrusion, an act of violence happening 30 feet below us. The closet sanctuary. Our reaction was not panic, but a sudden, terrifying presence. Every cell in my body focused on immediate survival. We crawled off the bed and moved not toward the door, but to the deepest, darkest recess of the room, a massive, antique wardrobe carved from oak. We slipped inside, pulling the heavy, scented door shut. The space was tiny, smelling overwhelmingly of old linen and cedar dust. It was absolute, crushing blackness, a sensory deprivation chamber designed for fear. We huddled together, pressing our backs against the cold, unyielding wood of the cabinet, forcing ourselves into a posture of minimal sound. My entire world was reduced to two sounds: the agonizing, wet pounding of my own heart against my ribs, and the ragged, shallow breaths Rowan was fighting to suppress beside me. Then the boots came. We heard the heavy, measured thump, thump, thump of men on the wooden staircase, not running, but walking with a slow, deliberate certainty, the sound of people who knew they were in control. There were at least two of them. The sound of their voices was a low, aggressive mutter in Italian, utterly indistinguishable but radiating cold menace. The boots reached our floor. They moved from the hall into the bedroom. They were inside the room. I could hear the slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards, the rustle of clothing, the quiet, focused violence of people searching for valuables, searching for witnesses. The boots stopped. They were right beside the wardrobe. I felt Rowan's small, cold hand clamp over mine, a desperate anchor in the crushing darkness. I pressed my face into the moth-eaten velvet lining of the wardrobe, praying my suppressed exhale wouldn't betray us. I heard a heavy, ragged sigh, a breath drawn in by one of the men. Then, the sound of a hand brushing the surface of the wardrobe door, a soft shk of rough fabric against aged wood. They lingered there for an eternity, the absolute total proximity of death, separated by a thin sheet of carved oak. Every fiber of my being screamed to move, to run, but the survival instinct demanded a deeper, colder stillness. After what felt like an hour, the heavy boots moved away, back toward the staircase, descending with the same slow, inevitable rhythm they arrived with. Minutes later, we heard the faint, distant sound of a car engine starting and fading into the deep Tuscan night. We remained locked in the wardrobe until the first, pale light of dawn crept through the keyhole. We climbed out into the silent, shattered room. The horror was not the blood, but the terrible stillness. My father was gone, and the beautiful villa was marked forever as a place of violation. The return and the wisdom. The years that followed were a relentless, chaotic struggle with trauma, guilt, and fear. The fear was a quiet, cold tenant in our minds, always whispering about the fragility of life. 10 years later, Rowan and I, now young adults, bound together by that night, returned to the villa. The house was exactly the same stone, wood, and the relentless cicadas. Our goal was not to exorcise a ghost, but to reclaim the space of our own minds. We spent a week in silence, moving through the rooms, accepting the immutable fact that tragedy had happened there, that the brutal finality of life was played out beneath those very rafters. But in that acceptance, the trauma began to transform. We didn't become victims, we became aware. We channeled that raw, hyper-alert terror, the focused presence we had felt in the wardrobe, into something useful. We started working together, developing situational awareness training programs, teaching people to listen to the sounds of violation, to recognize the difference between a house settling and an intruder's scrape. We teach that the worst thing about terror is the sense of helplessness. But that night, locked in the dark, we learned the most brutal, critical lesson. We survived because we achieved perfect presence. We were completely present in that moment of danger. Life is fragile. We know that better than anyone. But the story of the Tuscan villa isn't one of death. It's the story of the profound survival of those two teenagers. That raw, immediate courage and chilling presence in the face of absolute horror did not destroy us. It transformed tragedy into hard-won, absolute wisdom. And that wisdom that life is fragile, but awareness is immortal, is the anchor we carry now. You can turn off the lights now, but the dark doesn't always listen. Maybe tonight, when the house settles and the wind slips through your window, you'll hear something move just beyond the edge of sleep. A footstep, a breath, or the quiet reminder that not every story ends when the sun comes up. If you made it this far, you're one of us. Subscribe for more true horror stories every night. And remember, the next sound you hear might not be the house. It might be your story beginning.